and good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on busting grant writing myths. My name is Kara Godleski, and I'm the Member and Marketing Engagement Specialist here at Nonprofit Hub. I'm here with Teresa Huff, and we're just so glad you could join us on this webinar Wednesday. Before we get started, I just want to take a minute for everybody to start to roll in, get comfortable. So in the meantime, you can feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, say where you're from, and I also do have a little icebreaker for today. Since it is the new year, of course, I'm going to be basic and say, what is your New Year's resolution? So my New Year's resolution is to read for at least 20 minutes every day and work smarter, not harder. So that's going to be my New Year's resolution. Yeah, we have a lot of people rolling in. Wow, we got people, greetings from snowy Utah. Hello from California. Liz is up in Vermont. Oh, we got people from all over today. We got Joe's from Canada. So wow, we got a nice diverse audience here to join us this afternoon.
I always love seeing the different locations where everybody's from.
What do you have a New Year's resolution?
I do not have a resolution so much anymore. I do a word of the year instead of resolutions.
Cool. What's your word of the year then?
This year it is occupy. And so that's kind of a little different twist on what I've done before, but I'm excited about it. I started doing those way before it was cool or a thing to do a word of the year. I've done it for like 15 years, and I just have a little list that I keep track, and it's been fun.
Oh, I like that. That's awesome. Delaney said, what does occupy mean?
It means several things, but about a year ago, someone had told me, like, I was trying to figure out what to do next, how to better serve nonprofits, or where I wanted to go with the podcast. And she said someone had told her it's time to occupy the space you've created. And so that kind of just stuck with me, and just in considering different aspects of it, and like when in the Bible, when the Israelites occupied the promised land, or in business, when sometimes you have to step it up and occupy and own it. So
I love that.
My word this year, it's time to occupy. Why have I done all this work if I'm not ready to just step it up and go to the next level, whatever that may look like?
Yeah, I love that. Natalie, too, she commented, she says, own your space, Teresa.
Oh, thank you. Reciprocity, that's a good one. Commitment.
Yeah, so we have some awesome stuff here in the chat. A lot of people.
We can't wait to go back and read all these.
I know. Yeah, we have some great comments. So awesome. So before we get started, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to our platform partner, FireSpring. FireSpring provides strategic guidance activated through creative marketing, printing, and technology solutions to help businesses and nonprofits sponsor. I also do just have a few quick housekeeping items. If you attended our webinars before, you will know that we always do a giveaway. So today's giveaway is that we're having our grant writing course. Teresa Huff is awesome, and she helped create that for us. So we're going to have whoever stays the duration of today's webinar. If you participate, answer the poll questions, and just engage and ask questions, you will be entered into the giveaway. And the winner will be announced in the follow-up email this afternoon. Awesome. This webinar is also going to be recorded, so you'll get any resources that we mentioned, any resources Teresa talks about today. So we'll include that all in the follow-up email. And of course, at the end, we'll be doing a live giveaway, or excuse me, a live Q&A. So feel free to drop any questions. We will try to get to all of them at the end, maybe answer some as we go. So if you have anything, feel free to drop it in the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Teresa. She's a great, just a really great teacher. She has so much years of experience. She's done TED Talks. She has just an expert in nonprofit strategy. She has won literally millions of dollars of grants for nonprofits. So she is awesome. So we're really going to be in for a treat today. So I will pass it off to her.
Thank you, Kara. I'm really excited to be here, and it's always fun to talk grants, especially with people who I know really care about nonprofit work and really want to help and serve in your community. So I love that, and I love finding ways to help you. And as Kara said, I have won millions of dollars in grants, but I also want to say that the reason I'm talking about these top 10 myths today are because a lot of them I learned the hard way. And I want to help you avoid some of those. So that's why I've put this together. And that's why it's a lot of fun to talk about, because I want to help you fast forward and close that gap a little bit. Instead of having to muddle through and figure out some of these things like I did, I would much rather help you. And most of these are things I wish I had known when I was starting out. So with that, I will pull up my screen and hopefully everyone can see. And the top 10 myths, and in a way, it's time to refocus our efforts a little bit, because I know you're already working hard in your nonprofit or in your grant writing work, whatever your role is. I know that you are driven and wanting to serve in this way. So let's talk about some ways that we can use your efforts to maximize that impact as much as possible. I have including a couple resources here that Kara will send you on the follow-up email, that a quiz if you're thinking about grant writing and just not quite sure if you have what it takes. And if your nonprofit has been struggling with grants or is not sure where to start, you can go grab the free grant readiness audit, and it takes you through some questions on both of those. And then, as she mentioned, I host the Grant Writing Simplified podcast. So make sure you subscribe to that, because I provide a lot of resources and have a lot of amazing guests and interviews and even more tips and advice there for your grant writing. So when I ask the question, well, I want to ask you a question. Let me start over. What comes to mind when you hear the word grant? And I'd love to hear just a few comments, just first thing that pops in your head when you hear the word grant. Pop it in the chat if there's something in particular. A lot of people are saying funding, money, work, data, deadlines, mission support, capacity, a lot of different things. And these are all different parts of grants, which is absolutely true. And really, a grant is a lot of different things. It's a lot of these things. A lot of it restricted. I saw that one. And yes, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Genies. Yes, some people think so. So this is interesting because it's good to think about. Those of us who are in nonprofit work, a lot of us understand because we've seen the ins and outs and maybe already applied for grants. But a lot of people that we work with, such as board members, community members, volunteers, may not quite understand what a grant is. And so when we put ourselves in their shoes from their perspective, sometimes we don't always have the same definition or the same understanding of what a grant is. So it's important to make sure that we're all on the same page. Someone said ridiculously specific. Yes, definitely so. And so we're going to talk more about these today, of what a grant is, what comes to mind. And the reason I want to talk about these myths is because we also need to understand and recognize what a grant is not and why it's important. Because when, say, a well-meaning board member says, oh, just get a grant for that, that's not the easy route. That's not how grants work. And you don't just go get a grant. It's not like running to the grocery store and I'll pick up some milk while I'm out. It's a whole process in and of itself. So I want to give you some tools to help people think about grants a little bit differently. A lot of times there's something that we've always known about, like a grant. We know it's a way to get money, but we don't understand that there are actually other ways to use it. For example, anyone ever seen this or used a pop can tab in this way? I mean, I was an adult before I realized that you could even do this. I don't know if that's why they were created that way, but someone decided that was a good use, and then your straw doesn't float everywhere. So with grants, sometimes it's a matter of looking at what we have, from a different perspective and using them in a different way to help us maybe in ways we hadn't thought of before. So let's get into some of these myths, because I want to also allow plenty of time for questions. And if you have questions as we go, be sure to pop those in the chat and we'll keep an eye on those. And I want to make sure and answer specifics about those as much as we can. So the first myth, and tell me if you have heard of this one, is that we can just open up our nonprofit with grants. We'll just start a new nonprofit, we'll get some grants to get it off the ground, and we're good to go. Anyone heard this one? So to be ready for grants, there are certain things that you need to have in place. And how do you know if you are ready for grants? You need a solid plan. You need your website in place, your networking, your 501c3. You need to have your programs up and running. But then say if a nonprofit maybe has 3 people on their board and they're all related, they don't have any money, they don't have any other kind of support, and they're not serving clients, they don't have any programs up and running yet, then they are not ready for grants. So if you're running your thriving, grants come later in the process, and that's actually something that once you're established, the grants can supplement, as opposed to the startup phase. And so the fact number 1 is funders don't want to be your first dollar or your only dollar. Grants come later down the road after you're established and have other money coming in first. Then grants can supplement. Myth number 2 is the noble need. One time I had a well-meaning business that came to me and said, "We would like for you to find grants for our pumpkin farm." And I thought, well, yeah, no, that doesn't sound real likely. And so I told them, I don't think the odds are going to be really strong that you're going to find grants for this. And they were just sure that there were grants out there for this pumpkin farm. And so I did a little bit of searching and I said, there's really not much out there. There are some loans for small businesses, but when you're in a high poverty area, very rural, grant funders are going to be looking at some of those big needs, and you've got kids in poverty or senior adults who don't have the food and medical resources they need. Compared to a pumpkin farm, it's probably not going to fly. So even though this is a wonderful community service, you have to look at what is the actual need the community feels and that the funder is looking to fill. And so funders have to prioritize when they're looking at 2 things side by side, which one is going to be the best presented, but also the best priority that's going to meet needs in the community and make the biggest impact in the community. So that's what we always have to be keeping in mind. Even though we love our mission as we should, we have to look at it from their perspective too. Myth number 3 is that grants are easy money. And it sounds like a lot of you in the chat have written grants before, so you know how untrue this is. You don't just get a grant and you don't just decide, okay, let's write an application, we'll get in a few $100,000, we'll call it good. That's not how grants work, even though sometimes, again, board members, volunteers, community members think that's how it works, or think, why can't you just get a grant for that? But it's not always that simple. And as a lot of us know the feeling, sometimes grants are actually a lot of work to put together, to gather the information, to get all the documentation, in addition to actually writing a compelling narrative with well thought out research and statistics and data to back it up. It's a whole process. And then once you are awarded the grant, the work begins of implementing according to the program that you laid out, tracking the budget, making sure things are staying on course with how you had mapped it out. So it's important to keep that in perspective, and at the same time to make sure if you are applying for this grant, does your team have the capacity to manage it and to take it on? I had a client who we were just starting with grants for them. They were new to the grant space. And she said, you know, if we got $1 million grant tomorrow, we would not be ready for it. We just don't have the capacity to handle that kind of funding right now. And so that's something to keep in mind. What do you have the capacity for? What are you ready for? And what could you manage if it's awarded, best case scenario? And is your team ready for that and capable? Because that's also building your capacity for future projects, and it's building your reputation with a funder. And so you want to set yourself and your team up for success with that to make sure that you do have the capacity. With any grant, you always have to weigh the risk versus the reward. Is this worth the time and effort and team capacity that it's going to require compared to the potential reward, relationship building, the funding that it could bring in? So always think that through as you're applying and as you're considering which grants to apply for and which ones to forego. Number 4 kind of goes along with this. Grants, some people think grants are quick money, and really nothing about grants are fast. Most grants are really slow process. The application, usually you have a window of time to be able to submit that, unless it's an ongoing open application. But then it's usually several weeks to even several months or up to a year before you hear anything back. And if it is awarded, then sometimes it could be a few more weeks before you actually have the money in hand. So grants are not fast. Nothing happens overnight. And in the meantime, once you've submitted the application and while you're waiting, it's good to give funders some space to make sure they have time. They don't need us calling saying, hey, when are you going to announce that? Hey, do you need anything else on our application? Could we send you this too? Just give them space. They've had their deadline. You submitted everything on time. Leave it there. Leave them alone. They don't need all the applicants and hundreds of people asking them when it's coming out. Just be patient. And that is tough. It's really tough to do. And it's a little nerve-wracking. Sometimes that's the most nerve-wracking part of the process, is waiting and not knowing any day now, are they going to announce it? And so it's a relief to hear the awards finally. But grants are a long process. And so it's not an emergency fund. It's not a quick fix. Sometimes I'll hear board members throw out, oh, we're almost out of money, or we had this breakdown, we should go get a grant. You don't just run out and get a grant real quick. It's a very long process that has to be planned out over time. And that's why I work with nonprofits to build out their grant strategy, to figure out those puzzle pieces that fit best together. Because it's not a last minute haphazard thing. It has to be more strategic and long-term. And then it will pay off over time. And then unfortunately, some people think nonprofit or that grants are a bountiful well. Like, oh, we've gotten this every year in a row. We're going to keep getting it. Or there's plenty of money to go around. There's lots of it for everybody. We'll definitely get a grant because we know somebody there and they said, yeah, they like our stuff. But the truth is, sometimes things happen. Sometimes funders take a hit with their funding. Sometimes money runs out and just goes dry. Sometimes they only have enough to give to a couple of applicants. And so you just never know. You can't count on it forever and ever. It's not always going to come through because sometimes the well runs dry. And that's why it is important to have diverse sources of income, because we do need to have multiple places of making sure our nonprofit is supported, as opposed to relying on one grant or the same grant over and over. If any one of those went away, would you still be okay because you have enough other sources of funding in place to still be sustainable without the grant funding? So that's important to not just count on something year after year and take it for granted, because you never know when the funding will be cut. And during COVID, I know one funder that we had worked with several years in a row had said, our funding took a huge hit this year because of stocks and everything has just really dropped. And so their entire amount that they had to give out was much less. And so fortunately, we did get awarded again, but she had tried to prepare everyone like, we just cannot give as much out this time. And so you never know. And it's always important to make sure you have a good base of different funding sources. And this is a myth that I used to believe myself too, and that I hear pretty commonly, is that if we got this one grant, we shouldn't tell about it because they'll think we don't need the money. Or we had this other big donation, but we shouldn't tell the grant funder, or they'll think we won't need their grant money. But that's actually not true because if you think about it, say someone comes to you, like your friend comes to you and says, hey man, can I have $100? And you're like, why should I give you $100? And they're like, oh, because I just need to go do some stuff. Can I have $100? And then someone else comes to you and says, hey, we are doing this fundraiser for this really good cause. It's for the Children's Hospital. And we've got 10 businesses who are donating $1,000. We've got 50 people signed up to come. Will you donate $100 so that we can meet our goal? Which one's going to be more appealing to you? The one that's just like, hey, can I have some money? Or the one that says, look, we've got 100 other people involved. This is a really cool thing we're doing. We're making a big impact. Would you join us? That's going to be a lot more appealing, and it's going to seem a lot more credible because other people are investing in it too. Together, you can do something that's much more impactful because of the collective effort. So if you think about it in that way, then it's actually helpful to share what else you have in the works and that other people are supporting you as well, because then it's a group effort and you're working together. And so show why your organization is worth supporting and show that other people think that you are worth supporting too, and build your case in that way. And the next one, open season. Some people think that grants are just money's going to rain down, and that if we send out the applications, the money just comes flowing in. And that's just how it is. We can use it for whatever we want to because we've just got money now. And actually, this goes back to something I saw in the chat. Grants have 3 R's: restrictions, responsibility, and reporting. And actually, I'll add a 4th one, a bonus R, relationships as well. So when you get grant funding, of course, there are specific requirements that you have to follow in the application. And this will be outlined in the funders' guidelines of how they will and won't allow the funds to be used. And you need to stay within those. And in your application, you're going to outline your project within those restrictions. And then also, once you're awarded, you have the responsibility to implement according to what you said you would do. And this is where a lot of people get mixed up. They think, oh, we just get grant money, we can do whatever we need to. We can fix our furnace, we can put on a new roof. But if the grant was for your program, for your food pantry to provide food, then that's what you have to do with it. And then also the reporting, there is an accountability to it to make sure you're tracking your finances, your orders, your spending, the impact, the data. And I like to track both qualitative and quantitative. So meaning the actual like counts and numbers, but then also the feedback and what are people saying and how is this making a difference in their lives. So keeping track of both kinds of data will help your reporting be more effective. And it also helps to build the relationship with the funder. Maybe send them a few pictures of your program in action, or just send them a note even when they didn't ask for it. In like, they'll probably have certain report deadlines and requirements that you have to fulfill, but maybe just in between those, send a note saying, hey, things are going really well. Just wanted you to see a quick update on what we're doing. And that's a proactive way to build relationships with funders and help them see that you really care about their mission too, of the work that they want to do in the community, and that you care about them as a person. I say it a lot, there's a person on the other side of everything we write. So we need to write for the person, whether it's a grant, an email, whatever. It's about people. These aren't ATM machines. So it's important to make sure we're building those relationships too. And then another one is close enough, thinking that, yeah, if we can just, maybe get close enough to this mission, the funder wants to do this in the community. So, we're pretty close. We're kind of doing that too. So let's just apply for it anyway and see what happens. And they should give us money. but actually close enough a lot of times it can be a disaster and is not quite what they're going for, and they will see through it. So it's important to make sure that you're finding the best fit with their mission, what they're looking to do in the community, and with the work that you're already doing, and not try to bend your mission out of shape, but look for those things that are a really good fit to collaborate on. And then another common myth is that grants are cookie cutter, that grants can just all cut and paste from one to another. Once we've written one, we can just slap it into all the other applications and call it good. When actually grants need to be really customized, because it might seem easy up front and it might seem like a good route to go because that'll save time. We can just write it and slap it in. But we know after a while that can kind of turn into problems and cause a lot of trouble if we're trying to make things fit when they really shouldn't. And so it's important to customize each application. Most grants are going to ask for similar information. They're probably going to want your organizational background, the work you're doing, describe your mission, things like that. And they're also going to want to know about the program and what are you going to do with these funds? What's your budget look like? So there's going to be some similarities that you can have. And I do have kind of a bank of information so that I'm not describing our organization's history from scratch every single time. I can pull from that bank, but then customize it each time and make sure I thoroughly answered the questions. Because even some applications, there may be 4 or 5 questions wrapped up into one question. Like it might say, describe your program design. Tell us how this will really impact the community. What will you do with the funds and how will your program change as a result of this funding? So there might be like 4 or 5 things that you have to answer in one question, but you have to really break it down and make sure you've addressed each part of those sub questions within there. And so this might mean taking what you've already done and reworking it and revising it, or moving it around to different sections to make sure it matches up with what they have asked in each section. Because even if you put something somewhere in the application, if it's not in the section where they've asked that question, you might not get points for it. They may not go hunt it down somewhere else. So make sure you're addressing things where it needs to be and not just trying to cookie cutter, cut and paste from one to another. And then the last one is thinking you can do it all yourself. The Iron Man approach of this being a one-man show. And this again goes back to relationships and having your team in place, whether that be your staff, your board members, volunteers, your program people on the ground, all those pieces, plus the grant funder. They are there as a resource and they are there to help you. They don't want you hiding out and doing this all alone. Most of the time when I have called a grant funder to ask about if they, if I could ask a few questions about the application and just talk through our idea with them, almost every time they're happy to, because that's what they're there for. And they get better applications that way. They get better quality and they get a better return for what they're doing. And then that also helps set the stage for better programs that they can impact. So really communicating is a big key there to make sure that you're working together with them. And I know that may seem simple, but it's actually something that some people are kind of afraid to do. They're afraid to reach out to funders. But again, funders are people, and usually they're pretty caring people because they want to help nonprofits. They want to help support your mission. And so they need to be able to understand what you're doing, and they're there to support you. So we don't have to worry or be afraid about that. Now, I'll do a quick recap, but before I do, I'm going to pop over and see if we had any questions come through in the chat. And it looks like we have a really good mix of some everywhere from people have not done much grant writing at all to people that are pretty good and have written quite a few grants. So that's awesome. But I would love to, see what questions we have. And then I'll run through the list again, just a quick high level. So Kara, did you have anything that you saw in particular that would be a useful?
Yeah. I also wanted to point out one really interesting thing about the poll question. We really had across the board, we had only one person that thought they were an expert, but most people really, it was a pretty even mix of from not confident at all to I'm pretty good. So we kind of had a nice range of people and some really great comments in the chat already.
Yeah, I'm excited to
but we did have,
and see it.
Yeah, we did have a couple questions, so I am going to just pop some up on the screen. It said you mentioned that the new team needs to seek out other funding resources before considering applying for a grant. Like what other kind of resources were you referring to?
Okay. So if you think about the life cycle of a nonprofit, when a nonprofit is brand new and they are just starting out, that's not the time to worry about grants. Grants are a little more of an advanced strategy down the road, like training for a marathon. It takes time and it takes building up those muscles and stamina. So that's what you're doing. And so early on, one of your first steps will be to start with other fundraising, like having your board get involved. Make sure you have a large enough board. And that's going to vary depending on your nonprofit, but 3 or 4 is usually not a big enough board. I like to recommend starting with at least 7 to 9 quality board members who are involved, who care about the mission, and who come from a good mix of skill sets, backgrounds, personalities, connections. And so it starts with the board, and then you continue working from there and building your fundraising plan, making sure everybody's on the same team with that, everyone's on the same page and understands that they can get involved and how they can get involved. And I really like working with nonprofit boards to help them understand their role and also how to make the most of each person's unique skill set and personality. And so whether that be having fundraisers and getting people involved that way, or setting up monthly donation programs and a recurring giving model, which can be a really good thing for new nonprofits or at any stage. Major gifts, there's lots of different ways that you can do that. And I have a podcast episode that I started out thinking, okay, I'll just list off 10 ideas for fundraising. And it ended up being like over 60 ideas in the episode that I'd be happy to send you in the follow-up email. And with the caveat of think through a specific set of questions first. Don't just try to take on 60 fundraisers, but what do we have the resources and capacity for? What makes sense in our community? What makes sense for our team and our stage of growth? And then we can go from there to figure out a plan of how to map those out. And so really starting to, and some nonprofits have like a services, fee for services model. Or I worked with a food pantry that had a thrift store, and the thrift store actually supported the expenses for the food pantry. So there are just a lot of different ways, depending on your type of nonprofit, how to get that started. And then once you have some of that established and have a good solid foundation of income to pay your bills and get things growing and moving and some momentum, then you can start moving into some more grants.
Yeah, so it kind of seems like this person, Alexa, she said, like, if you had a team of 1, maybe don't start out with some grants right at first then.
Right. I agree. Yeah.
Maybe do some fundraising, and maybe if your board can help out in other ways too.
Yeah, figuring out what would make the most sense with the resources you do have. Because yeah, when you're a team of 1, that's tough because you're wearing all the hats and that's a big job. And so yeah, that's where figuring out the amount of time for each thing and how much to spend. And so like you said, getting your board involved with some of the fundraising activities is important. And then maybe prioritizing a couple of small local funders because you can build relationships. And usually on smaller local foundations, the grant applications are not as intimidating and time intensive. It can be smaller. You can start to talk to the funder and let them get to know you and build trust. And then you could probably handle some of those smaller applications without having to be a complete grant expert the way you would for grants.gov or something like that.
Yeah, so talking about grants.gov, Margaret was saying, what are some ways to search for them?
Mm-hmm.
Like one person, like Kelsey, even asked, like, how do you even find grants for like operations? Like you don't know what's out there. Where do you even start?
Yeah, and operations is a tough one because a lot of grants still want to fund programs, but there are some good search databases that I've used. Some are paid and some are free. It's everything from Instrumental, which is a very robust paid database, to free resources online. There are several searches like Grant Gopher, Grant Station, Candid, which used to be called Foundation Center Online or Foundation Directory Online, and that has changed names, I believe, to Candid, but either one would bring it up. And a lot of local libraries have free access to the Foundation Center's grant database to the professional level, which is pretty expensive. But if your library has it, then you can usually go and access it for free at the library and run a bunch of searches and either email them to yourself or download them. Then you can go home and sift through them. But that allows you to search by location, by keywords, by funding amount, all different search factors that you can change the variables there and find some that way to start identifying. And then, I mean, there's always Google search, but we know what a rabbit trail that can be. And a lot of times keeping an ear to the ground, see if you have a local community foundation, because they are often an umbrella for multiple grant opportunities. And so they might be able to advise and point you in the direction of specific local foundations that may not be quite as advertised or may not have a website online. But if you know who to ask, who to talk to, you can find out.
Yes, so that's awesome. It's great information. So if somebody does have a grant writer, but they're kind of new to it, like what would be good education or like where to start? Like what should they prioritize like learning at first?
I really like teaching the strategy and the process behind grants. And like some of these things we're talking about today, I think it's really important for the team to understand. Even if they're not all grant writers, it's important for the development team and the board to understand the purpose of grants. And I talked about this in my TEDx talk of grants. Really, we have to build our ROI, which comes down to relationship or to relevance, to optimization and interaction. And we have to have those three things in order to really make an impact. And we can have two of those three, but if we don't have all three, we're still missing just a little piece that's not quite going to click. And so once we have those in place, it's really going to make a lot of difference. And so educating the team on that strategic piece of what grants are for, what they're not for, and just understanding that can then help them better supply the grant writer with information that they need or understand how to collect data, how to report, how to be tracking information. And really that spills over into other areas of development too. Because if you're collecting this information anyway, it's going to be useful in your fundraising, your other programs, your marketing. It has a ripple effect throughout the organization.
Awesome. Okay, so if you have a lot of grants, multiple grants that you're applying for the same project, do you have like a best approach or a way to kind of like navigate that?
This, I need to know a little bit more to advise specifically, but just in general, I can say I think it's good to figure out kind of a tiers of the project, because ideally, if you mapped out all your grants and you had the whole thing covered, that's wonderful. Say it's $1 million project and you're going to get it from maybe 10 different grants, and that would be ideal. But we know that that may not be realistic, even though that's what you want to aim for. So how can you maybe break it down and segment that of, okay, phase one, if we only got this much funding, here's what we'll be able to do. If we got the next phase or if we got more funding, we could also expand that to this piece. So kind of staggering and stair-stepping that as well, and then supplementing with grants and other sources of funding at the same time, then can also help ensure that the project can keep moving, and then you're not dependent on waiting on another grant. So what else could you do to help kind of set up some insurance for yourself in a sense, that to make it stronger. And again, it really comes back to building relationships with the funders and communicating with them along the way to make sure that they understand the project, that it's a good fit with their mission before you apply for anything. And then it's not guaranteed that you'll get the money, but you know that your odds are going to be a lot better if you've communicated. My son is coming in funny.
I know. It's like the sun's moving on you.
Yeah, trying to dodge it.
So let me try to find this one question. So here it was, how can a small local nonprofit compete with larger national organizations? So we did have another kind of similar question about somebody in Baltimore having a lot of competition too with grants. Like, how do you handle a competition or competing with maybe an organization that's bigger or more well-known?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. And that's tough too. I would say look for funders, again, that are a good fit and build those relationships and let them get to know you and build that trust. The other option that we haven't talked about is maybe consider partnering with other organizations. Could you partner with a complementary organization, either doing similar work, maybe serving the same population, but in different ways? Or maybe say you're a food pantry in this county, could you partner with a food pantry in 2 or 3 other counties and team up that way to have more numbers? I've done that before with a very small rural school district, and we partnered up 2 neighboring school districts. So that gave more numbers for impact. They were very similar demographics, low income, high poverty areas. And so we were able to get federal funding for them because we could show the impact in this community as a whole by having those partnered up together. So sometimes just looking at it creatively, how can you think outside the box? How can you collaborate with others and really building those relationships, whether it's with the funders or with other nonprofits?
Yeah, so we also had one other question come in on the registration sheet, which I kind of thought was an interesting one and important one to ask. It was just about how, like, if there's supposed to be, an upcoming recession, do we give any predictions of how grants might be awarded or not awarded or change if that happens? What do you think?
Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see. And I think it will depend on the funder, and it will depend on their initiative and the types of investments they have available. Because even like, say, during COVID, when we thought, oh no, everything's kind of screeching to a halt, in a lot of ways, there was even more funding and nonprofits did better than ever, which was surprising. And so even with a recession, there may be some funders who see that and who really want to step it up and say, okay, we know this is the time of need. It's crunch time. We need to step in and fill that gap. So, that will be an interesting thing to see. It's hard to predict exactly what's going to happen. I think we'll see some of both. Some are going to maybe slow down, and then some are going to step up.
I guess that kind of goes back to making sure that you have a diversified revenue source as well. Yeah. If you're worried about grants being pulled, then maybe think about ways to fundraise as well.
Yeah, and keeping both. And then ideally, you could have a really good influx, but yeah, making sure that you're kind of setting yourself up for success from whichever direction. So then it's like in the stock market, they say don't put all your money in one stock. You need to diversify. And so same way with nonprofit income, don't base it all on one source.
Yes, awesome. Okay, so let's see. Do you have any recommendations for a system that can handle like due dates, or if you're working with a lot of different grants?
That's a great question. There are a couple of softwares available for that. I have always been a good old spreadsheet girl, which is not everybody is.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, and a lot of people use task management systems, which if they are not specialized for grants specifically. So that can be tricky or frustrating if you have you're sharing it with the team, or you have to do a lot of work just to fiddle and get it set up. But I know GEMS Grant Easy Management System, I believe, is set up just for grant project tracking. Again, instrumental. While it's a search tool, it also handles the ongoing tracking and project management. Let's see. There's another one. I can't think of the name of it. You may remember. I don't know if you would or not. I believe Flux is more of a grant making tool, but then some people use integrate it into their current CRM or database type system and just set up extra tracking features within that, the way they would track their other projects, and then they'll just set up grants as an additional project. I don't know that that's ideal, but that's one way that I've seen to do that. And I think we lost Kara right quick, but that's okay. I'll keep, when you're applying, let's see, I'm looking for other questions on the fly here. Curious about differences in applications for local.
Hey, Teresa.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Kara was getting slammed. And I realized too, while you guys were talking, that we had like 20 questions come in from like questions people asked before even registering. Okay. So that's awesome.
Okay.
Let's see. I heard you do the one about.
Oh, there was one here I just landed on. Curious about differences in applications of this info for local governments applying for state or federal grants, or number 2, organizations that are not service providers like advocacy, political, or organizing. On that one, I would say goes back to the funder guidelines and really look at that, because the guidelines will specify whether or not some of these types of organizations can apply or not. And like maybe political would just be completely off the table for a certain type of funder, but then for another one, it might not matter. So really look through the guidelines to figure out which things are a good fit and which ones are not.
This one, Brandy asked a question, and I apologize if some of these were already answered, but it did say answered. That's so nice. Let's see. Kelsey said, how would you recommend organizing a grant bank? Not necessarily to copy and paste, but to have something generic to work with to answer questions.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do like to have that on hand for my clients. And so essentially it's kind of like a case for support where you have the different sections that are commonly asked, like maybe your mission, history, background, board member list, certain things. So I like to organize mine with the basics at the beginning, like just their address and basic information at the very beginning of it, and then move into like the mission, vision, core values, the things that are unchanging. And then I move into some of the other pieces that are more fluid, like the need, the programs, evaluation, testimonials, and stories. So then those pieces are updated more often, because that's where you're going to be gathering more data as you go. And so that's where you can keep that fluid. And then you can also use that document for other things within your organization, like marketing or website copy or social media posts here and there, just to put little snippets out. So it's good to have that bank of information gathered.
I laugh at this one. Kelsey said, we have a lot of competition in her area, Baltimore. How do we handle going about accessing funds when there's others who are going for it as well? And the reason I laugh is because back when I was in my master's program, we put on an event called Nonprofit Shark Tank. Just because it's true. Like there's a lot of people looking for the same.
It is, and that's tough. Yeah, and that's where it's really important to be on your game. Communicate with the funders up front before you start applying. Make sure it's a really good fit. Make sure you've gathered data. How are you showing that impact? Are you tracking the impact well ahead of when you need it? Because when you're sitting down to write the grant, that's not the time to decide, oh, we need to start looking at how much impact are we making or how many people are we serving. You should already have that from way back and make sure you have plenty of information to pull from. So then when the time comes, you've got it and it's solid. And also the data showing like statistics and the need for this in the community, and really just making sure you're on your game with that. And again, it comes back to that ROI, the relevance, making sure you're optimized internally with your organization, and then the interaction, building the authentic relationships.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a good one. I want to say her name is pronounced Kiara. What is a timeline to start hunting and applying for grants? This is a great one for people who might be.
Yeah, that is good. I would say if your nonprofit is brand new, work on some of the other things we talked about. Get your internal operations in order, get your board trained and up and running, make sure things are running smoothly and you have other funding sources. But say you're a few years down the road, you're at least a couple years in, then you could start looking at it. And if you've never done grants before, I like to recommend starting with small local foundations, because then, for one, it's the chance for your team to learn the process and understand just how do grants work. It's also building relationships, and it's giving you the chance to learn the process at a much lower stakes level. It's much simpler. You can work through it. You can build the relationships with the funders. And then that helps you start building a track record of success by building, earning 2 or 3 small local grants. You can leverage that. You can maybe step up a little more. And then you're, again, building the relationships, but also building that capacity that, okay, we understand the process. We understand how to report, how to manage the funds, how to track the budget, all the pieces. And so we can handle a larger grant, and you can gradually move up from there. It's like training for the marathon. You're building your stamina and your muscles around that.
Natalie asked, where do you see organizations falling most short when it comes to their grant deliverables?
That's a good question. I would say, well, and I guess my question is, would that be before, like when they're trying to apply, or after it's awarded? That would be my question, just to clarify. But I guess when it's on the application,
after awarded.
Okay. Well, on the application side, it would be maybe not having all those pieces in place. But after awarded, sometimes not tracking the budget properly, not keeping track of all the invoices and spending and how that should go, which ideally you'd have that in place already. But also, sometimes it's a matter of not implementing according to the questions in the grant, or not following through with the program. Like maybe one person wrote the grant, someone else is responsible for implementing, and they didn't really communicate, or the second person didn't really understand their role in the project and didn't look at the application even. So sometimes that's where it falls apart. And then the reporting isn't being tracked properly. So that's not submitted on time. And then that hurts your reputation with the funder. It can even jeopardize future funding. So just really making sure the team is all on the same page. And I was interviewing someone who oversaw a team for a hospital foundation. So it was pretty sizable and from a lot of different departments within the hospital. And they would actually sit the team down, everyone that was going to be involved once a grant was awarded. They would pull everybody in, sit them down and go through it and have them sign off on, here's your responsibility, here's what you need to be implementing. And then they would track that and track the timelines, but they would make sure everybody had this in front of their face at some point to understand, this is your role, here's what you're responsible for, and making sure there's some accountability built into the process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you just said answered, I think, a lot of the concerns about some other people who had questions about how do you help your ED and board understand that they can't just haphazardly apply for grants without having a program fully planned out in advance. And that was really similar to Jason's question, who said, a managing up question. I can explain like the best practices for grant writing, but how can we like suggest to the ED that you put the cart, not put the cart before the horse? wanting to apply for grants before
That's
the org
a tough
is ready.
one. That's where you send them my TEDx talk and say, watch this, because that's exactly what I talked about there. And that's why I talked about it, because so many people are, just saying, oh, just get a grant, or we should just do that, just get grant money. And that's not how it works. And some people just don't get it. They don't understand it. And so a lot of times we need that outside resource to say, okay, listen to this. Here's what it goes, because it can be awkward when you're trying to manage it up. And let's see, I want to make sure I've read this one. Yes. That is sometimes if you can find, whether it's an outside resource, an expert article, even just someone else that could talk to them, and that's tricky as far as like a board member. But if there's someone else along the same level, or that could be in an advisory role to them to help them understand that. And sometimes that comes from bringing in an outside consultant, or having the board president take the lead and saying, hey, we need to make sure we're clear on here. And then if that's not possible, then maybe starting with what we talked about a few minutes ago, with having a core case for support type document, where you have these things outlined, and like maybe just have blanks for each one and say, okay, as a team, I need us to compile some information so I can better handle grant applications on our behalf, so that I'm representing us well when I'm writing about it. So can we take some time to make sure we're clear on these, so that I'm conveying our needs well? And that way you're asking for help. And instead of, like you said, managing up, instead of chastising your boss for not doing something, it's more like, can you help me do my job better? And reframing that, you're still getting the information you need, but you're reframing it in a, hey, I'd love to get your input to make sure I'm on the right track here. Could we get a team, have some team brainstorming and collaboration here to make sure that this is where we want to go with this? So sometimes it's shifting the narrative around it to help them see it differently, or see the reason for it. Sometimes if we just tell them, hey, I need you to do this and you've got to send me information. But if we say, okay, our entire funding for next year is dependent on this piece, I really need your help to make sure it's a success. It's a success because we need this funding for our programs. And so just shifting that a little bit can make a lot of difference.
Teresa, I know that you wanted to do a brief overview, and I think that there were some questions about, what is myth this one? And like you were going over some lists, and I know that you wanted to do kind of a brief, like bird's eye view of those. There's 3 minutes left, so let's do that. And then if people want to stay a little bit longer and answer more questions, we can.
Sounds good. Yeah. Pop my screen back on again. Okay, so just a quick recap. And grants aren't your first dollar or your only dollar. Funders have to prioritize. So sometimes that means they may have to say no. It doesn't mean your project's bad. It just means they can't fund everything. So with that in mind, we have to weigh the risk versus the reward of, is the application a good fit? Is it worth it? Grants are a long game. It's not going to happen overnight. Grants are not guaranteed to keep going forever and ever. Make sure you share, don't keep it a secret, but show off your other sources of funding to show that you are sustainable and capable. Keep in mind the 3 R's, actually the 4, the bonus are restrictions, responsibility, reporting, and then also relationships.
Teresa, did you see those other R's that people were throwing
No,
into
I
the
can't
chat?
wait to go back and read the chat.
You'll have to look at those.
Okay, so we'll say like 50 R's or 100 R's. Yeah, that'll be great. By the next time I do this, it might have like 10 slides full of R words.
Yeah.
Yeah. And looking for the best fit before you apply. Customize each application. You have your core information, but you make sure it's custom to answer their questions well. And then play together as a team. It's a team effort and it takes a team approach. So I would love to hear one last question too, is which of these myths have you heard the most in your work? Or maybe which one have you believed the most? Because I know when I started out, I thought a lot of these things were the case and I didn't know any different. So I would love to hear from our audience which ones that they hear the most. And then also I included a slide that you're welcome to send out if people want to connect with me. I love hearing and meeting people who are on these, and I love getting to know the work that you're doing and just hearing about your work in the community. So please shoot me a message or connect with me and subscribe to the podcast, because I'd love to. It's always fun to see what kind of work people are doing out there and the variety.
Yeah. I think a lot of people are saying that grants were easy money.
Yeah.
I'm seeing that a lot. Quick and easy.
And a lot of board members seem to think that, oh, just get a grant. Can't you just write a grant? You're the director. Can't you just get some grants? That's one I hear a lot. And I just wanted to say, no, it's not that easy. I did see one quick question. Are community foundations a good place to start? Yes. Yes, they are great, not just for grants, but for building relationships, for hearing about other resources, training, other types of support, or even just people who serve nonprofits and maybe understand the nuances of that. That's a great place to build some relationships.
Mm-hmm. Well, Teresa, this has been excellent. I know everyone was really grateful for everything that you shared, and we'll share, okay guys, the recording we'll have for you. We'll have some links to the resources that Teresa just mentioned in that last slide. We'll include the chat. I know everyone's kind of interested in seeing the chat, and everything else that's been requested, as well as Teresa, you had listed off some grant databases and things like that people had suggested using and things. So we'll try to include them as much as we can in that follow-up email. So keep an eye out, everyone. We will be in contact. You guys are also engaged. I absolutely love that. But one of you will have access to Teresa's amazing grant writing course that's in the Nonprofit Help Cause Network. So someone from our team will contact the winner of today's
And
webinar.
Doesn't that, am I remembering correctly, if they complete it, I know I had included quizzes and things along the way, and if they complete the full course, they get a digital certificate? Yeah.
Yes, you do. You get something to build your resume, and everyone loves getting a certificate for all the hard work that you put into learning. Awesome. So we can't wait to see you guys finish that course. And yeah, join us next week. Teresa, thank you so much.
It's always fun to jump in with you guys, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored. So thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone. Happy New Year.